Hello and welcome back to the 7th video in my Managing Stress Q&A series. Okay, so let's get onto it. So once again, I've had a few days off from this. So the weekend and then yesterday, like Thanksgiving week stuff kind of got in the way. So yeah, my anxiety about doing this is built back up again. So again, I just wanted to note that pattern for people that are doing who are taking on any challenge that's maybe outside their comfort zone. Just know that if you do end up taking some days off for legitimate reasons, that it can feel like you've been avoiding even though you haven't really, and then your anxiety increases about getting back into it. But it should be okay once you get started again. So it's really important to get back on the horse with things, and as I sort of said in one of the other videos, the easiest way to do that is to do little steps toward that. So for example, I got my the questions and who sent them in on a spreadsheet, so make sure that that's set up, make sure the tripod is set up. If you were, for example, if it was an exercise routine, you might get your exercise clothing ready, or make sure that you've got cold bottles of water in the fridge, or whatever it is that you need to do the thing that you to do the challenge that you're setting for yourself. Then do as many steps as you can to reduce all those barriers to getting restarted. Alright, so let's take some questions. Alright, so let's okay, so this is from Yvonne, a different Yvonne than one of the, we had a Yvonne in one of the prior videos. This is a different person, and she asks, what is the significant difference between stress and mental health, and can they be used interchangeably? Yeah, so no, they can't be used interchangeably, and I think especially companies kind of get into that dilemma. Companies will sometimes provide stress education or stress resources for their workers, but and think they're providing mental health support, but they're not quite the same. So obviously you can have a bunch of serious mental health problems. You can have eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, all sorts of problems that any mental health problem can be exacerbated by stress, and sometimes problems can be triggered by stress. The start of a problem can be triggered by some kind of stress, but often what happens with mental health is that once you have a mental health disorder, then the mental health disorder and the symptoms of that become the stress. So you might have other normal life stuff going on, but having a mental health problem itself is extremely stressful for people. So for example, someone with bipolar disorder might really struggle to communicate with others about their needs, if they're needing to keep their routines consistent, but their boss keeps wanting to put them on shift work or change their shifts around, or that kind of thing, and they need to keep their sleeping and eating routines and everything the same to help with their bipolar disorder. Or maybe that they're struggling to afford medication or therapy, or all of those kinds of things. So, and in the case of any mental health disorder, it can really shake your identity. So for example, if you think you're somebody that's kind of a high achiever, or you've always been you're a perfectionist, or whatever it is, and you get a mental health problem, then that can really shake your identity, and you wonder whether all the hopes and dreams for yourself that you had previously can still happen. You wonder if you're actually this weak person, if you've seen yourself as a strong person, and maybe other people are seeing you as strong, but then you have this mental health disorder. Then it can make you really wonder whether those things you believed about yourself before were true. So they can't be used interchangeably, but they're definitely related, and there are specific treatments for different mental health problems. So if you've got panic disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever, there are treatment protocols that have been studied for those specific disorders, where you really want to get the protocol that has if you're going to have treatment, you really want to get the specific protocol that has been studied for that disorder. There are some transdiagnostic protocols that are used for different problems, and in reality, when people have a mental health disorder, they often have more than one. So they might have social anxiety plus depression or something like that, and those can be useful in those cases. But if you've got a specific mental health problem, there will be some parts of the treatment for that specific problem that are useful to you beyond just more generalized cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance commitment therapy or whatever program of therapy you're doing. So yeah, they can't really be used interchangeably, but stress certainly makes those problems worse. And even people with mental health problems can benefit from learning skills to reduce their stress and how to handle stress better, but that's not sufficient, and it's not a substitute for something specific to the actual problem. And people that have a specific disorder like obsessive compulsive disorder or whatever it might be, any of those other disorders that I mentioned, they need to understand the mechanisms of their specific disorder, like how it works and how it traps them. And you won't get that just from general stress education, but learning stress skills can definitely be extremely helpful for mental health too. Alright, so let's take another one. Alright, this is from Robert. Since it is stressful to figure out people's bad behaviour, would it not be a bad idea to avoid news of bad behaviour? I think we can lose our vision, identity, appreciation of life when we hear too much news that our safety is uncertain. What do you think? Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think that it is useful to avoiding anything is generally not a good idea, right? So there is an extent to which though that you do want to understand what you're trying to do if you're consuming, like for example, a lot of news. Like if you're consuming a lot of political news, sometimes people do that because it feels like keeping up constantly with every development is reducing uncertainty, when really just keeping up with like 4 or 5 hours a day of news is not really reducing uncertainty or increasing your safety at all. So sometimes people do that excessively because they're trying to reduce their sense of uncertainty, when that's kind of false. The same thing would be like if it's related to a family member. So kind of constantly keeping up is not necessarily or being hyper vigilant to what someone else is doing. Like imagine in a scenario where somebody was alcoholic or abusive or that kind of thing, and their family member was constantly keeping tabs on them to try and reduce uncertainty and reduce safety, like you and increase safety. So that is often that sort of hypervigilance is often not useful. It's often not doing what you hope that it is, that you would hope that it's doing, and it sometimes can erode your sense of safety as well. But on the other hand, you don't want to, especially with sort of world news and things, everyone's got a responsibility to kind of be a good global citizen and have some awareness of what's going on generally, rather than just being in their little bubble. So there is some balance there. I think that if you are consuming a lot of news, whether that's family news or workplace news or industry news or political news or global news or whatever it is, I think that Robert's point here, we can lose our vision, identity and appreciation of life if we're like constantly being hyper vigilant to some type of news and keeping track of whatever goings on there might be. Like you can end up kind of like just being like a something that's waving around in the wind, and you can lose sight of the goals and things that you want to be working on personally. Like for example, maybe you've got fitness goals or other personal development goals or career goals or skills or goals for gaining skills or whatever it is. And if you're keeping tabs on everything external that's going on to a really large extent, then you're often not going to be pursuing those other things. So you really want to understand that balance there. And we all have a natural tendency to want to do what's easier over what's harder, right? And so it's easier to like sit there on your computer like listening to Colby or listening to all sorts of news or whatever it might be than it is to be getting out there and running or getting out there and working on whatever skills or personal goals that you might have, working on the DIY projects around your house or whatever it is that's personally important to you. It's easier to, even though it seems stressful, sometimes stressful things are still easier than the alternatives, and we will always tend to lapse into doing the easier thing, even if it doesn't make sense to be constantly, even if it doesn't seem like it makes sense to be constantly exposing ourselves to all of that extra stress. Alright, what else? Alright, let's do one more. What advice would you have for one whose perennial stress is rooted in inexplicable panic, fear of failure, due to a bigger fear of disappointing people and its potential long-term effects in a working relationship or working environment? Okay, so this is from Mario. So I think if you've got a fear of disappointing other people, some of it you've got to kind of figure out where that has come from, right? So it's good to have people. One of the things I said in the anxiety toolkit was that, and I probably said it a few times, is that one of the stupidest pieces of advice ever is to not care what other people think of you, right? So that caring what other people think of us is a huge evolutionary advantage, right? That that in our ancestral environments and even into today, like getting excluded from your tribe is really dangerous. Okay, so caring what other people think is adaptive, and we see with narcissism and that kind of thing, like when people don't care what other people think, how toxic that can be, or when people don't care about what certain segments of people think. They might need adoration from a few, but not care that they're transgressing against a whole bunch of other people. And all of that it's good to care what other people think, right? But you want to understand why you've got this big fear of disappointing people and where that's come from. So sometimes people have a fear of disappointing other people because they have some sort of deep, dark sense that they're flawed in some way, right? They feel like there's something about them that's fundamentally unacceptable to others, right? And they think that the only way to sort of cover that up is to be really perfect and to never disappoint anyone and to over deliver all of the time and that kind of thing, because they see that sort of over performance and perfect performance as a way to protect themselves from being judged for whatever fundamental flaw that they might have, right? Or that they think that they have. And if you have a sense of having that, you want to try and understand where that comes from. So for example, I was like pretty anxious as a child, and my family weren't really sure what to do with that, right? So I sort of grew up with this sense that I didn't have a very easy personality. Like my sisters had easier personalities than I had. I was kind of a bit difficult because like I didn't want to go on school camp or all of those kinds of things. I had this anxious nature that needed someone that knew how to handle a kid with an anxious nature, and not it's the majority of parents are not going to know that, right? So I grew up with this sense that my personality was kind of difficult, and that I wasn't the easiest to love, I guess. And so that is the sort of pretty minor, in the grand scheme of things. It's not like a huge trauma or neglect or anything like that. But that sort of minor sense that you get growing up can lead to that adult issues where you feel like I've got to protect myself from anyone finding out that actually I'm really difficult, or actually I'm this, that, and the other thing. I think I was always told growing up that I was pretty selfish, and and which, you know, might be true a little bit, right? But for what, you know, for whatever reason, I think sometimes that people that are anxious can become a bit selfish in a self-protective way, right? Because they're they their needs feel so overwhelming to them because of their anxiety that they become very insistent on getting their own way and getting their own needs met, because they don't really know how to handle it if they don't. So yeah, so I guess I have a constant worry that of doing anything that gets judged as being selfish, like in work relationships and that kind of thing. So yeah, so try and figure out if you have got if you have. So Mario mentions like this inexplicable panic, fear of failure due to fear of disappointing other people, right? Things are not usually inexplicable. So there's usually some explanation. It just might be quite a subtle one about where you've developed that sense of always needing to be perfect, and that sense that disappointing someone ever would be really dangerous. Like it might be, and maybe it was people that in your life that seem disappointed with you, that you always tried to please, but never could please, or that kind of thing. Like maybe you had like a parent with depression who was always irritable, and you grew up feeling like you could never please them. You felt like you were tiptoeing around all the time, and no matter what you did to tiptoe, or no matter what you did to try to keep them happy, they were always irritable, always grumpy at you, or whatever. So try and figure out where that fear of disappointing other people has come from, and so what you think about yourself that might be disappointing. What's that little nugget, even if it's not very logical, what's that little nugget inside you that you feel is like fundamental to you, that you're worried will be disappointing to others, and where did you get the idea that you couldn't, that just being yourself wasn't going to be enough to avoid disappointing other people? Or where did you get an idea that other people were super hard to please, like we're being just, you know, like performing at a reasonable level, being competent, doing things well most of the time? Where did you get the idea that wasn't acceptable? So I would say it's not when people have that when people have a fears that they think are inexplicable, they think are you know, they're not sure what the root of that is, then there's usually something, right? There's usually some deeper self-understanding, or an understanding of key events in your development that you need to get and need to understand better. Alright, so we shall leave that for today, and yeah, I am back into it, and yeah, just again, like cognitive psychology is just so helpful to me, and sometimes I forget that. Like sometimes I think I forget that even with everything I know, I still have false thoughts. So I really, you know, again, I said my anxiety increased about doing this again, and that the thought that creeps up with that is, I don't have anything to say in response to these questions. Like I don't have anything interesting to say, or these questions are harder than the other ones, or those kinds of things. And then when I get to the end of the videos and I've done it, I think to myself, oh, actually, like I had more to say than I thought I did, or I had more that was in depth to say than I thought I did. And then I realized that the thoughts were faulty, right? That actually the questions weren't harder than the other questions, and actually I was more competent in answering them than I thought, or whatever. And again, like that's just an example to show you of how it's actually doing stuff that helps you correct your thoughts, right? It's testing out the thoughts. It's not like pre-gaming. It's not hyping yourself up, or like standing in the mirror and saying affirmations, or it's not trying to talk yourself out of thoughts in advance. It's actually doing the things that you're scared of, and then evaluating the thoughts and understanding the thoughts better, and doing the things that make you anxious is a test of the thoughts, and it helps you. It's that actual lived experience that helps you see when you've had faulty thoughts, and that's like what the research generally suggests, right? That the best way to change thoughts is through behaviour rather than trying to directly impact the thoughts themselves. So that's just what I sort of explained is what I mean by that. Like, my behaviour is, I was scared about answering questions, so I answered the questions, and it was the behaviour of answering the questions that made me see that my anxiety about doing it was, and my anxious thoughts were faulty, and it was unfounded. So yeah, just to give you an example of like that process working in real life. And if you're watching this, and you've got things that make you anxious in your life, then try and find a way of applying that model to what you're anxious about, and see if what I just said is true for you. See if doing the thing helps reveal faulty thoughts to you. Alright, so so I shall be back in the next day or two. It's Thanksgiving week, so it's a little bit busy this week, but I will do as many of these as I can. And thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of the day.